All right, we're back for another Modified Rides podcast. Today, I have a fellow podcast host, which I guess is what his current role is. He's
One
been
of them.
involved with the industry for a while. Today, I've got Sean Holman on. What's going on, man?
Hey man, how's it going? Thanks for having me.
So I've seen Sean's name. I guess everybody calls him Holman now. I guess you've stepped to just your last name.
So it's still weird. I just wanted something to when we had when I launched this podcast. It was the Truck Show podcast with Lightning and Holman because it was too wordy to have our names in there. And my co-host already had a radio name, and so I didn't want it to be like with Lightning and Sean Holman. It's just weird. And then now people in when I write, for all my magazine stories and stuff, it's Sean P. Holman. And so now I'll get people who yell, "Hey, Holman!" So I know they're listening to the podcast, and then people in my real life are like, "Hey, Sean." So I don't know. It's I answer to lots of different names, including "Hey, you."
So when I first started doing the magazine photography stuff, I'd seen his name pop up, with some of the publications I dealt with. Had never really got to interact with them, but as a aspiring photographer back in the early 2000s, I would spend hours in Books a Million or Barnes and Noble reading, bylines and the editorial page to see who people were to know who I needed to link up with. So, how did you get started in the publication world, and when did you start?
Man, I started back in the early 2000s. So my degree is actually in criminal justice. I was going to go be a police officer, graduate from police academy, and things just didn't work out the way I wanted them to, and it had me kind of second guessing what I wanted to do. And while I was kind of cooling my jets for a while, I actually worked at Boeing doing fire and security at a plant here in Huntington Beach, California, where I live. And this plant was pretty special because they built a bunch of sections for the Saturn V rocket back in the day. There was a mission control for the space shuttle that was on site that did engineering support for Houston, looked just like the Houston one with the
Oh
consoles
wow.
and the big screens and all that. And while I was there, two crazy events happened, and that was September 11th. So you can imagine working as a security officer at a defense plant on September 11th, and then also the Columbia disaster happened as well. And so it was a really interesting time to be in that part of securing a defense contractor site. But what it allowed me to do is I work graveyards, and I always, even from when I worked in the police department, I love graveyards. And so it allowed me to freelance during the day. And so I had a friend of mine, Ed Sanchez, who worked for a little B2B publication called Bobbit Media. They had a bunch of magazines. And he goes, "Hey, I need I know you know trucks. I need you to go out and shoot or would you be interested to go out and shoot this Fab Tech install on a Nissan Xterra at this place called Aggressive Performance or something like that?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure, no problem." So that was the first magazine article I ever wrote. That turned into writing some installs, doing some stuff for Modern Tire Dealer, which was another B2B. And then eventually I went to the Magellan Rally, which was a big rally out in Arizona, and met a lady by the name of Allison Harwood, who was at, I think she was at Truckin' and also Truckin's SUV at the time. And then now she's at KBB today. But her and I became good friends. And she's like, "Well, what do you want to do?" I'm like, "Oh man, I love off-roading. I want to get into four-wheeler. I want to get into Peterson's, one of those." It's growing up as a kid, I had 13 magazines a month that came to my door. Like I just ingested automotive magazines like nobody's business. And so she called me one day and she said, "Hey, they're looking for an entry level editor job at Truckin'. I know it's not exactly your thing, but Truckin' kind of covers a lot of different things, including off roading. So maybe get your foot in the door." And I'm like, "Ah, okay." So I put in an application, and Steve Warner interviewed me, and basically got the job. Barely over 30 grand. In fact, I think they wanted to bring me in at 30, and I'm like, "No way." And I think I was all excited because I talked them up to 32 or something like that. Uh, yeah, I went from there. So I worked my way up at Truckin' Magazine, with all the guys, Bob Ryder and Travis Nowak and Dan Ward and Harley Camarilli and, anybody else you can think of from that era at Truckin'. And we had a great staff, right? We had a great team. We went all over, covered all these shows. I mean, uh, good friends of mine to this day that worked at some of our sister publications like Finnegan, Freiberger, Johnny O, you know, all of that kind of stuff was awesome. And I still keep in touch with all those guys today, which is neat. But um, from there, we went. I had my chance at Four Wheeler Magazine, and I got promoted to technical editor over there. So that was a really good deal. Worked there for about 7 years, and then helped launch Diesel Power Magazine. Helped launch 8 Lug. Became the editor in chief of Diesel Power Magazine eventually, and then I also did a bunch of SIPs like 4x4 Garage and things like that. And then I also helped launch Recoil magazine for you gun guys out there. So from
Did you have any kind of background in writing or photography before you started?
I just like to do it. I think just reading all those magazines growing up was just it kind of taught me how magazines get written, and I just had a natural knack for it. And the thing that's really served me well in my career is two things. One is I decided early on that I wasn't going to chase Lamborghinis. Like everybody goes, oh, I want to go write for the magazine because I want to go do Lamborghinis, and they end up doing minivan reviews. But I realized at the time, like there were no truck experts, and so that served me really well because I got into the space of being a truck expert, and that's sort of why I got notoriety and got promotions because like they kept going, oh yeah, he's the guy, he knows trucks, and of course during that period of time, trucks were crazy. Um, but no, I just I had a very natural knack of taking, complicated engineering topics because I grew up with family friends who were engineers and friends who were engineers, and distilling it down to how the common person could understand it. So I was really good at going into like a new vehicle review or going into a fab shop or going into a aftermarket parts company and them saying, this is why we made this widget or this is how. And then I could write that in a way that the common guy could understand. And that's kind of what I did. And then from there, they promoted me to run the truck side. So truck in, truck trend, mini trucking, diesel power, and then I eventually got the off-road side too, Peterson's 4 Off-Road, JP four-wheeler, and I ended my career at Motor Trend Group after being bought. I think it was 7 or 8 companies while I was there in
Yeah.
20 years. It was crazy. Johnny, I think it was Johnny Hunkins said it best. He said, "We have the best job in the world one day at a time," and we all knew it. Like we for the first 10 years, you're kind of like trying to stay scrappy, then second 10 years you're kind of trying to stay alive, and I outlasted more than most, but that's because I made relationships and protected my guys when I could, and stood up for myself in the company. And that was probably my biggest takeaway in a corporate environment like that was always changing, is nobody was going to advocate for you but you. And so did that, and because of that we were able to have some really great teams and magazines and times. And one day they said, hey, we're getting rid of four-wheeler, and I said, oh, and they said, you're being laid off too. And it was like, oh, okay, great. And, I knew the day was coming at some point. Didn't know it would be that day.
I know you mentioned the different companies that owned it. I'd get a check in the mail back when they actually mailed checks back then.
Yeah.
I'd have one show up and I'd be like, well, who is this? I don't even know who this is, and have to research it and realize that it's a new publishing company.
We used to joke about how to remember it. It was Pepsi 10. It was Peterson, EMAP, Source Interlink 10, which was the enthusiast network. You go on down the line, but I mean, we have so many owners, and people are like, are you worried for your job? I'm like, every single day of my life. But I've done incredible things because of this. I've raced in the Baja 1000. I've wheeled and visited 4 different continents. I have been in an LAV 25 doing a story with the U.S. Marine Corps, seen the USS Tennessee, Ohio, the class ballistic missile sub in dry dock, out of the water, and got a chance to do a tour inside and walk under it. I mean, how many people could say they walked under a boomer?
Yeah.
So,
Well, my dad was on a boomer for 18 years, so
okay,
I grew up around that life.
very cool. Yeah, I have a friend of mine who's a podcast listener, and he sent me a picture. He goes, "My truck is bigger than yours," and it was him in the con driving basically Ohio class, and ended up sent him a bunch of swag, and went out to Kings Bay, Georgia, and they rolled out the red carpet for me because of my support of the Navy and sending them a bunch of stuff. Because with as you know, with boomers, they don't go to ports of call. They don't get to surface and go to cool places. They're underwater for 60, 90 days, whatever it is, protecting this country. So whatever they bring, podcasts that they've downloaded, magazines, whatever, that is all they have. And so I kind of got in with the leadership at Kings Bay, and they invited me out, and it was a really great experience. My point is, like, even though I'm a writer, and even though I took pictures of trucks and things like that, I mean, that's essentially what I did, right? I have been able to experience far more in, my lifetime in what I've done so far than most people will ever get to do. I've seen concept cars, or I've seen production vehicles 5 to 10 years before they ever came out. I've been on, proving ground racetracks with 140 miles an hour. I've gone racing. I've gone to cool places. I've seen things. I could tell you certain vehicles, like, oh, that thing that's there is like my influence on that. I've lived like 5 lives already and gotten to do so much cool stuff, but it's all because I was a magazine guy.
Yeah. So I guess with your final titles there when you was at the publishing company, I guess you were the one that was over most of the editors that I dealt with.
Yeah, yeah. So I was basically over that, and then I was on a leadership team with basically the person that oversaw the hot rod side, the person that oversaw the in market, which was the motor trend side, and then above that was the president and C-suite people. So I'd gotten pretty high up in the food chain, um, but it was really because I think my management style at the time and still is, even though I don't manage people like I used to, um, empower people to do their job. Like we're all grown ass people. We're all adults. I didn't get my pants on differently than yours. The way I always told my guys was like, listen, the only reason I get paid more than you isn't because I'm smarter, isn't because I'm more handsome, isn't because people like me more. The reason that I get paid more than you is because the responsibility stops with me. And I want you guys to always tell me what your ideas are because I'm never going to tell you, oh no, we're not, we're going to discuss it together. We're going to win as a team. We're going to lose as a team. But at the end of the day, the buck does stop with me. But I don't let that dampen anything that you want to do because I respected them all as people and as adults and as professionals to bring the ideas to the table and execute. And as long as they did that, I let everybody run the way they thought they could. And I built a lot of relationships because of that.
Now, did you see the writings on the wall when it come to all these magazines going away? Like, did you know it was coming, or did it just kind of blindside you?
Sometimes I knew it was coming because sometimes I would be in a meeting where they would talk about it. I had to be in meetings where we had to kind of go through people and properties that were being truncated, and other times it didn't go through me. My last SEMA, they had hot rod and motor trend branding everywhere, and no four wheeler. And I had gone up to one of the people in leadership, and I said, "Tell me you're getting rid of four wheeler and my truck group without telling me that." No, no, you're good. No, it's not like that. Friday afternoon after SEMA, I get an email for a strategy meeting in the morning on Monday. Brought my laptop into the strategy meeting, and they said, "You don't need that." I went, "Okay, I guess this is where it ends." And I knew,
Because when I guess it was what 2014 when the big chunk of the magazines went away
that,
at one time.
that was pretty hard. Yeah, yeah, that
I
was.
actually put my camera down for a while after that because I'm like, if all these magazines are going away, what's the point of me going out and hustling? Because I had a bunch of stuff that was on file at several different magazines. It just went away at that point.
Yeah, that was a really bad one, and I believe that one we were at the LA Auto Show, and it was toward the end of the day, and we were on media day there, and my phone starts blowing up. And one call was, "Hey, they're marching people out of here." Another call was, "Hey, they're marching me out of here." Another call was, "Hey, can you take over this group as well as the one you have?" Yeah, sure. Then the next call was, "Hey, I don't know if it's somebody called you, but something's happening." And the next call was, "Hey, you need to get all of your team together on an emergency meeting. By the way, you're running it because now you're in charge of this." And it was tough because not only was I in a position where I had to let people go, but it looked bad because I got a promotion out of it, which was awful. Like you don't want to get a promotion that way, but it was literally foisted on me at the last minute. It was like within an hour of that announcement, they were calling me saying, "Hey, this is yours if you think you can handle it." And I'm not going to say no, right?
Yeah.
And that was hard. And then this last, this one a couple years ago, that was tough as well. And I went out with some friends who launched Recoil Magazine with me, worked at Motor Trend. We launched OVR Magazine, and I knew what it was like because we had a lot of freelancers that got let go, and there's all of this content that was out there. So I basically told our guys at OVR because we were brand new, we didn't have a budget yet. It's just five dudes own this magazine, and we told all these freelancers, "Hey, if you need a place to park content to make it right, we can't pay you, but if you need a place, throw it our way." So we got a ton of content to launch OVR because I knew there were a lot of freelancers, like in your case, that you had shot something or had product or whatever, and you're like, "Well, what am I going to do now? Now these magazines are defunct, and I've got these parts on a truck, like I'm screwed." So I reached out to as many of those people as I could and gave them basically a safe harbor to finish those commitments, just because I understood how it worked and the pressure people would be under.
Now, what was the final downfall for all those magazines going away? Was it just advertisers pulling out, or just were they not making the money anymore?
That's funny, the whole advertisers side of it. So everybody, I mean, look at your background. You've got all those plaques of stuff you shot, right? You've got all those magazine covers. In fact, I see some magazine covers up over your shoulder that I'm familiar with intimately. Some of those I chose the photos on it. But the thing that's funny is all these advertisers would go, "Hey, what does it take to get on the cover?" And they'd be like, "Oh, you know, because they love lining their showroom with plaques." But it's like, wait a minute. You pulled out of advertising 2 years ago, but you still think it's valuable enough for you to be on the cover? I'm like, if it's valuable enough for you to be on the cover and have a plaque in your showroom, it's valuable enough for you to advertise. So I got into a few like skirmishes with some companies. I'm like, listen, it's editorial. You don't have to pay to play, but you should also know which side you're, bread the butter's on. And I never did pay to play ever, but I let people know like, hey, if you're so hard up for a cover, like you should be that hard up to advertise. And it was sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. People started pulling out, and as people started pulling out, because there's an ad to edit ratio of how many pages of edit for how many pages of ad, so naturally the package size would get smaller. So then somebody would go, well, wait a minute, I'm paying $6, $7, and this magazine's shrinking. Oh, well, it must be doing bad. And basically it just rotated and was like the toilet spiral as it all went down the tube, because people stopped advertising because they stopped seeing value, and then they stopped. Then it was thinner, and then people stopped seeing value on the customer side, so they stopped buying it, and it just worked its way into a mess. And part of it was, at the time, we weren't smart enough um, to right size our prices. I think if we would have right sized our ad prices at that time, we probably would have been able to retain a lot more. But we were too proud, and our budgets were built in a way that it didn't allow for a lot of function, a lot of flexibility. And in my opinion, I rather have more people at a little less money than just have some big people left and then have a thin magazine. Because the key is making people, understand that there's value in what they're paying for.
Yeah. So I guess if with the magazine got smaller, then you could have charged less and, like I said, and got more people.
Mhm.
Do you feel like I do that the internet has been a big detriment to the print industry?
It's partially that. I think the internet and print were pretty good hand in hand, because you could go off and research some topics that maybe you want to know more about. I think the real detriment was social. What we could have done early on, and what I recommended early on to management, was, if you remember back in the 90s and early 2000s, it was like, "Oh my god, that's David Freiberger at Hot Rod," or "That's Rick Payway at Peterson's 401 Off-Road,"
Courtney
or
or
whatever.
yeah.
Yeah, you knew the editor and you knew the magazine they were associated with. And what we got away from is we were the original influencers. And when social came out, I suggested to management that we allow everybody to put their social handles with their byline, so that we could keep that connective tissue with the magazine and the editors. And they said, absolutely not. We're not going to help somebody build their audience on our backs so that they can leave and go be our competitor. And I thought it was short sighted at the time. It ended up being the wrong decision, obviously.
News
Uh,
stations do it.
Absolutely. So at that time, we got our pride got in the way, and we were a little bit too greedy about who we were, and we let people self-publish without building up any defense of keeping our magazines protected with these names. And the other thing that happened was, as staffs got smaller, magazines got smaller, staffs got smaller, we gentrified the magazines. So you would have one writer on two or three magazines. Well, now the voice of Peterson's wasn't that much different than Four Wheeler. The voice of Truck Trend or Eight Lug wasn't that much different than Truckin'. And now people are like, well, why am I buying all these different magazines? The same guy is writing in all of them. And so those are two massive strategic errors that we made back then, which it's part of business. You don't know what the future is going to hold. I think some of us had a gut of what could have been done. And it's easy for me to sit here, 10 years later and Monday morning quarterback it. But the reality is I did bring up those concerns, and I thought the magazines would have had more longevity had we built a defense around it by including our people into our social and tying them to the magazines, and by not gentrifying it by keeping multiple magazines with the same staff.
Well, I know Brian McCormick mentioned when I had him on the podcast that, back in his trucking days before they started street trucks, it was before YouTube, before all the social media stuff, they were selling 250,000 copies a month. And then YouTube come about and Instagram come about and all this stuff, and it dwindled that down. So
Yeah.
it's crazy to see the amount of change. Even the magazine shelves back in the day were huge. Now they're 20 foot in the store if you're lucky.
If you're lucky, I mean, OVR is available nationwide at Books a Million and Barnes and Noble, and then we kind of have distribution spread out otherwise. But yeah, you go there. At least it's easier to find the magazine now. You're not digging through a bunch of competitors and whatnot. But um, we one thing that we did get smart with is we signed a relationship with YouTube, which is how Roadkill got started. YouTube gave us, I don't know how many, what the dollar figure was, a seven-figure dollar figure to work with them, creating content. And that's how Roadkill was born. And so we did leverage talent from the magazine on some video properties that obviously were really successful and lasted a long time. Dirt Every Day is another one. Um, but yeah, I mean, it was hard when people didn't need a magazine to publish anymore. They could self-publish, and it was even harder when people started buying their audience because there's for a period of time. I don't think it's true today, not as much as it was before, but today I don't think the number of followers you have means as much as it used to. Engagement is so much more important than the amount of people. But back then, you could have somebody who got there first, had no idea what they're talking about, spreading horrible information, and no decorum or etiquette for how you operate in a media space. And all of a sudden, now they're the big dog giving advice, and the magazine guys are sitting there going, "Hey, have you seen this Joker online? That's not you're going to get somebody killed. That's not how you do that." So that was kind of hard too. Is we all had our ego about being the big fish, and then we slowly had our lunch eaten as well.
So you said you were involved with the startup of Roadkill. I had Finnegan on a couple episodes ago. I worked with
Yes,
him some at Sport Truck and Mini Trucking.
yeah, I wasn't directly involved with Roadkill. I was involved with some of the ideation around different projects that were going on with our partnership with YouTube. That was more of a Freiburger, and we had a I think Mind Over Eye was a company we had bought at the time that did our digital TV and stuff. But it was kind of a fun time at the magazines at the company because it was like, oh, we're doing something new. This is interesting. Let's see what happens. And I think there's a lot of people kind of waiting to see like, is this whole place going TV shows? Are we all going to be TV stars all of a sudden? Of course, that didn't happen. Finnegan and Freiberger were the right people for the right time. In fact, when we got bought by Discovery Channel, what was super fascinating about that was they wanted to get rid of our content because they had bought us essentially for the streaming platform. We had Motor Trend on demand at the time, and they only had a direct to consumer or a direct through cable, not a direct to consumer place. So they needed our set top box technology, or what they call over the top. And so, anyway, the difference was the Discovery Channel shows were scripted, and ours basically weren't, right? And what happened with that is our content did better, and they were surprised by that, and that's because it was authentic. And so all of a sudden they realized, well, we don't have to pay all this money to have these highly produced shows that are scripted with the same formula. These guys at Motor Trend are doing this like kind of raw, gritty sort of deal, and it gave us some clout within the walls there for a while. And they, kind of left us alone for a while to our own devices. Not for too long though. That stuff never it never lasts too long.
Now they went through and wound up cutting all the automotive TV shows, though, correct?
I don't know what the full accounting is. I've been out for a few years. I still have friends, and I hear, but yeah, my understanding is some of that automotive content, at least all the stuff that we were producing, is basically done from a TV show standpoint, and the magazine portion just got sold off to Hearst, and then the television portion I think stayed with Warner Brothers Discovery. But I don't know if that's going to be housed only online or whatever. But yeah, it's a complicated business. TV and cable are crazy. I had no idea how it worked until I had to learn how it worked a little bit to understand how we could partner with them from one side of the company to the other. And, it's as cutthroat as print was.
So you were there when Motor Trend bought it out.
Yeah, so Motor Trend we were always the same company. They just changed the name to Motor Trend Group, basically.
What was the name before that? That was
So basically, it was Peterson Publishing, and then Peterson Publishing became EMAP, which was a European company. The EMAP sold to Source Interlink. Source Interlink was a company that was a distribution company, not a media company. And Source Interlink owned all the newsstands in the United States. So they thought, oh, if we own the magazines too, we could always ensure that our distribution is filled. Well, each time the company got sold, it was over leveraged, and so now all of a sudden servicing the debt didn't make sense. I think when Source Interlink bought it, I think they bought it for 1.2 billion or something like that. And I think at the time Chrysler had been purchased for like 800 million. So like we were more than Chrysler. I don't know, something like that, something really weird. And you're going, there's no way. And all those values were so inflated during that time. Um, And so anyway, Motor Trend was always our in-market side of the business. They just decided when Discovery bought it and they had Velocity TV, they didn't want to lose the Motor Trend branding because we had Motor Trend on demand. So they decided to rename Velocity Motor Trend
Gotcha.
and then rename the company Motor Trend Group, which encompassed Motor Trend, which is the in-market, and automobile, Hot Rod, which was the aftermarket group, and then the truck group, which was all the stuff that I ran.
So I know we'll bounce around a little bit here, but you'd mentioned OVR. So are you involved with OVR?
Yeah, so I'm one of the 5 partners, just 5 dudes. And we are 4 of us are Motor Trend alumni. My friend Mark Hahn launched Recoil. Well, we all launched Recoil together, and then it got sold out of the company. Mark Hahn went with him. Howard Lim was in charge of a bunch of SIPs and the import stuff. Jerry Sy was at doing a lot of our fun, like non-car SIPs. Like we had Geek magazine at the time, Recoil, things like that. And then he went on to be the editor at Tread. Then our other friend Lee is involved. Yeah, there's just 5 of us. If you guys are gun guys and you know Recoil magazine, the follow-on to Recoil is a magazine called UN12. That is our sister publication where all the Recoil guys started their own after Recoil got sold a couple times. And it's that really high quality, like coffee table book style. And that's how OVR is today. It's uses a lot of the same templates and even a lot of the same people as Recoil. So think of it as like a high quality, thick paper Recoil magazine for off-roaders and in that lifestyle.
It definitely has that thicker, fancier look to it. I met the what'd you say the guy's name that came from Tread?
Yeah, that would be Jerry.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
met him
Jerry.
a couple years ago at SEMA.
Yeah, so we got this
Yeah.
really gritty cover, super thick. We use it as our calling card. A lot of it, SEMA was a perfect example. A couple years ago at SEMA, we were begging to get meetings because people knew us. Yeah, you guys aren't really in. We don't know what you're doing. There's lots of people starting stuff. This year at SEMA, companies were coming out of the woodwork saying, "Hey, we have to have a meeting with you. We have to have a meeting with you." And we've sort of stepped into the vacuum that was, made when all these other brands like, Tread fired everybody. I think most of their stuff's being done in India and with AI and stuff like that. And there's a few other magazines that have recently died. We stepped into the vacuum of where four-wheeler kind of left. But the cool thing about it is now people are coming to chase us down. People recognize the value. And so we're able to grow in that space of what magazines used to be, nice, thick, great photography, great paper quality. We do it 6 times a year instead of 12. And then we have the website and all the digital stuff that goes along with it. But for 5 guys with no corporation that owns us, I would say that we're doing pretty good. Last year, we were in the black, and so we're making it work. And because we're not over leveraged like Motor Trend Group was by all those different owners, we have really low overhead, so we can survive and be nimble in the print space, even though we're privately owned.
Well, where do you see that print space going in the
I
next probably 5-10 years?
I think it's coming back. I think people are getting tired of looking at their screens. I think for some markets of magazines, especially for us, like, do you really want to be on your phone on Starlink when you're around the campfire? Or would you rather just have a good magazine to read and soak in? Um, Young people are turning back toward magazines. I don't think it'll ever reach what the heyday was, but I think for us niche publications that are really targeted and you could tell the love that comes into every story. Like for example, when you open OVR, we don't have any incremental ads. We don't have any quarter page ads. Everything's a full page. We don't cut up the editorial. We want the editorial to sing. So you're not reading a story and then halfway through there's an ad. Like we do that on purpose because we want to bring back the love affair with print and with holding a magazine, and we don't want to cut it up. Ads are secondary to the user experience within the pages of OVR. Even if you go to our website, ovrmag.com, there's no right rail, there's no giant banner ad. There's a couple ads every few pages you scroll, and we do that on purpose. Yeah, we can make more money if we loaded it with ads, but we really want it to be special for people who love magazines.
Now, you said that you started the podcast back when you were with the magazine stuff. How did the podcast come about, and when did it come about?
So it launched in March of 2018. So next month is my, I don't know, is it 7th anniversary, something like that. And the way it started was because I was running a group at the time, and it was around the time, not too long after some of the big layoffs, there was talk about, all right, print revenue is declining. What are you going to do to backfill it? And at the time, social was really cheap and highly engaging, and video was really expensive and medium engagement. Print was like medium effort, but high engagement. I was trying to find something that was in that middle ground. I'd been listening to some podcasts, and I would thought, man, this is really cool. I listened to Mike Rowe. The way I heard it was one of my favorite ones. There's, um, Joe Rogan back in the day
Yeah.
was a juggernaut. I mean, he still is, but back then it was even different because he was doing his own thing. And more and more people were kind of jumping into podcasting. I thought, man, I'd love to do something for us, but it might be too late because so many people have jumped in already, and there was, I don't know, 800,000 world podcasts. It's so hard to become discoverable. So I wrote up a business plan of launching a truck podcast, which at the time was kind of a hard sell because we were getting rid of brands to be more streamlined. And here I am asking to add a brand back in. And they told me, they're like, hey, why don't we call it the four wheeler and truck trend podcast? And I'm like, no, that's stupid. And they're like, well, we're not adding another brand. I go, yeah, but you're trying to chase a new audience for new revenue and new eyeballs. And you're going to name it the same thing? No. And they go, what are you going to call it? I said, we call it the truck show. They go, well, that's stupid. I go, no, what are you typing into the podcast search engines when you're looking for a truck podcast?
Sure.
You just type in truck show. Guess who comes up first? Me. So that was all by design. So I had to fight that argument, fight that battle with them and argue against it and say, no, we need to do this. And then I knew, because I had the marketing machine of Motor Trend behind it, that we would be able to leverage the social, and we'd be able to leverage the website to grow fast and block out anybody else in our space. So that worked really well. And they told me you have 1 year to make money, and we were making money off of it within 3 months.
Oh, wow.
And so I looked at him and went, and then it was funny because there's a lot of people who were really pissed off. I took over basically a broom closet, turned into a podcast studio, and all these other people started coming out of the woodwork at Motor Trend saying, oh, we want to do our podcast. We have to share all that. I'm like, I bought that equipment with my budget. I have it. Nobody cared about podcasts until I was successful. So you get to go through me. And that really burned a lot of people up because they didn't want to have to go through me, and they wanted to be able to have keys to the studio whenever they wanted. But because I made it my baby and I did it, I had some allies higher up who said, nope, this is Sean's deal. And nobody ever encroached and really pushed hard until the end. And then, there's a couple of podcasts that are part of Motor Trend. One of them is The Inevitable, which is about EVs. They partnered with an outside company called Westwood One for production on that and didn't do it in-house like I was doing mine. Mine was super scrappy. It was our first studio had Harbor Freight blankets hanging from the ceiling. I mean, that's how scrappy we were, because I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know, but I had to have good sound quality. We were in a concrete building where sound was bouncing off of everything, and basically just kind of figured this stuff out on my own.
So how often did you produce podcasts in the beginning?
It was always once a week. When, you probably know this, but in 2022 September, Apple with iOS 17, I think, completely changed how the podcast app works
Yeah.
and destroyed every podcast to the tune of 15 to 33% of loss of downloads overnight. And so that completely threw the podcast industry into a tailspin because everybody's like, well, all of our contracts are based off these other numbers you've been giving us. And now, because of how you download differently, 33% of my impressions are gone. And nobody's really clawed all the way back. So at that point, I realized there's a bunch of like dirty, rotten podcast people who were gaming the system to get higher in the rankings and the charts by doing like a 5-minute podcast. Like, oh, in case you missed it from Monday, here's what you need to hear. Oh, and sponsored by these 5 people. And that was the podcast. And then be like, oh, we have 2 shows a week. Yeah, we're gaming the system. We have all these downloads because everybody listens to the first one, wants to hear the second one, right? So all of a sudden you are 2x your downloads. So that helped a lot of people kind of claw back a little bit. So what we did was, our podcast is super long. It's 2 hours, hour 45. We try to do it shorter. People don't like it. They're like, oh, why'd you make it short? It doesn't fit my commute anymore, right? We got whacked during COVID. Then people started going back to work. We started climbing in and got whacked during the second round of COVID. And then the Apple thing whacked us. So what I decided to do was keep the long form show, since we had a lot of people like it. That's what we were known for. And then on Thursdays, we do news only, which is about a 15 to 20-minute short form show. And that way we kind of have both, but you're getting 2 good shows out of it. And you can listen depending on how much you have time for.
Now it's just you with the show now, as
Yeah.
of what, end of the year?
Yeah, January 1st. So Jay Tillis, Lightning, so my partner who, co-created this, co-hosted this with me, he basically, needed to re-engage with his family, and on his day job, got a promotion. So he had a lot of stuff going on, and something had to give. Unfortunately, it was the podcast. So that was really difficult because it's like, oh wow, I've got to learn everything now. And so, I'm literally, other than a buddy of mine, Dave Graham, who's helping with, some of the social on Instagram and whatnot, I do everything else. I sell the contracts, I book the shows, I record the shows, I edit the shows, I socialize the shows, I tag people, I promote them in groups, I do, all that stuff, and that's just one of my three jobs. I'm still, editor at large and partner at OVR. I have a marketing and consulting company called Use for Adventure, where I've got clients on that as well. So it's crazy, and it's it's one of those things that people think they talk into their phone and they push a button, all of a sudden you have a podcast. And it's like, no, there's production value. Like, I have high end equipment, we have jingles, like we have, it's done like a morning show, make it fun, and all that takes time. And it's funny because I've got this Facebook group called the Podshed Insiders. So this is a 10 by 12 tough shed that I built in my backyard that's fully soundproofed, and I've got a 4 mic setup and all that. It's really awesome. So we started calling it the Pod Shed. So the Facebook group is great because I got all this fast feedback. I've got about 300 of my top listeners in there who are always giving me feedback and stuff. But the criticism's hard to hear. Oh, we missed Jay, or we missed this thing you guys used to do, or we don't like the new jingle, or we don't like the new format. And it's like, here I am busting my ass to bring them 2 shows a week that they don't pay for at all. And then they they want to criticize you. On one hand, your ego has to be like, okay, you got to take the criticism because it's going to make you better. And on the other hand, you're like, no, screw you. I've been working really hard at this. You can't tell me I suck. So
So
it's
how
tough.
how hard was it to go from a two person to one person? Because you have the banter in between to now you're by yourself. Because I've never had the co-host like that.
Yeah,
What's the difference in the dynamic of that?
way harder. And so I have to map out the show so I don't just get lost talking to myself. And I'm like, well, all these other podcast hosts do it on their own. I can do it too. So what I've done is, obviously I get guests, so that helps out. And then I've kind of streamlined kind of bookends of the shows and different things that we did. And then I've done 3 things. One was, we're doing live shows, probably once a quarter, where I've got listeners who are on like a giant Zoom call. And we did one of those already. I've been having guest hosts, so people that are known to the audience that have either guest co-hosted with me before, or are people that they know and like, come and sit in like maybe once a month, twice a month. So that helps. So and then basically just me getting better. That's, it's hopefully, our numbers have been going up steadily since the beginning of the year, which is awesome. We've had some of our best weeks that we've had in 6 months. And I think people are really enjoying the new format. So fingers crossed that it keeps that up that way, and we just keep bringing great guests. We had Mike Rowe on. We had one with BFG tires are obviously big in our space, so we had the product manager for BFG come on,
Yeah,
and
check that one out.
yeah, and I had people emailing going, I never thought I would be so interested in a tire interview. And then the podcast that just came out today is Matt Graves from American Powertrain. So, we talk about how he became the bacon man of the automotive aftermarket, and all that stuff. And people don't realize they were one of the first companies that had a F100, uh, I think it was a bump side manual transmission swap. So they're just always trying to bring on interesting guests, different points of view, and it's never the same thing. Like we've done tours of AMSOIL's factory, like how do they make oil. We've had some guy who did some widget in his garage. We've had the CEO of a car company. We've had an entrepreneur who had 5 busted products before he hit it big with his other one. We've got guys who come on who are listeners, go, hey, I just bought this truck. I'm like, hey, we have the segment called You Review. So it's like, come on and tell us what you think. And, tired of hearing about me, let's do that. And then I've got something called What's in Holman's Driveway, because for OVR, I still get a lot of different trucks. And so I do like a 15 to 20 minute ride along and talk through everything about the truck. And then people really like that because it's like a magazine review kind of coming to life a little bit. So just try to keep it fresh and fun. And, we still have our silly drops and jingles and all that stuff, and still love what I do. And I've got a great group of listeners that keep me motivated.
Well, I know I'd always listen to podcasts when I was at the time, I was working at Pepsi because I was there 22 years. So a lot of times I had an AirPod or something in, just doing my job, listening to that in the background. Well, now if I'm detailing cars or doing whatever, I have an AirPod. Well, then I have times I'm in my office quite a bit or not where I can access a podcast, and I get behind and I'm like, crap, I got 37 new episodes to catch up with.
It's
So it's
hard.
like trying to do that. Well, when I started this a little over a year ago, it was just kind of one of those jokes. I sat down on the couch and had 3 free minutes. I was like, I'm bored. I got to have something to do. At the time I was doing the magazine stuff. I was doing some video stuff, and it's like I always enjoyed podcasts, and there's a lot of different niches or genres out there. You have like the mini truck stuff, you have the off road stuff, and it's like with my connections and my history, I can kind of dabble in everything. I've done the German car stuff, the European car, the lifted truck, the bag truck. Like it lets me branch out to people like you, and like I had Finnegan on, and I had Solomon on this morning. Recorded with him, and it's like the people that I deal with. So I have photographers, editors, that kind of stuff to bring, like I said earlier, insight to people that don't know.
And that's what was great. I looked around when we made this show. We said, "What should it be?" You had diesel podcasts, you had off road podcasts, you had pro touring podcasts, but there wasn't one podcast that did everything trucks. And so our taglines lifted, lowered, and everything in between. And we've gone to LS Fest, and we've gone to Daytona Truck Meet, and we've gone to some of the big shows like we would in the magazine days. And we do OE cars. We've done what's your project truck, where people are talking about their build. We've done all sorts of different things. And being broad, we just talk trucks. We've got a lot of over the road truckers that listen as well, as they're going cross country, and um, having that flexibility of not pigeonholing ourselves into anything, and having a name that's like Kleenex, I think has really helped us out, because people are like, oh, okay, I'll give it a flyer. And plus it sucks. We have a 4.8 review rating on iTunes from like 1,100 people. But we got in a podcast spat with another podcast, and they sent all their listeners to give us 1-star reviews, which drug us down. And I got most of them reviewed or removed from Apple, but not all of them. And so there's still a few that we should be like 4.9 and a half. So that kind of bugs me. But then I always said, you know what? Anybody that has a lot of reviews and is all 5 is probably lying, because you just can't get that many people to like you. And I've had guys who are like, oh, I'm going to give you a 4-star just because I didn't like this one thing. You're like, then why even leave the review? So I used to get mad. Somebody would leave you a 1-star and like, oh, this guy sucks. I'm like, wait a minute. You listened for 5 minutes. You decided you hated it so much you took time out of your day to tell me how much you hated it. And I told that to a buddy of mine who was big into podcasts. He goes, dude, no, it's great. Don't worry about it. And I was like, what do you mean? He goes, you've emotionally affected somebody so strongly that they had to tell you how much they hated you. He goes, that's engagement. So whether they love you or don't worry about what the numbers are. Worry about how many people are listening and keep coming back for more. So I had to really recalibrate myself on what success was when I launched the podcast, because I thought success was everybody loving you. But no, sometimes people just give you a hate listen, and that's okay too.
Well, I mean, all you got to do is grab that phone and swipe that thing across to, if it's a subject you don't want to hear about,
I
go to
know.
the next subject.
You would think that's what they would do, but some people, they just have to let you know how much they hate you. And again, I used to be offended by that, and I realized it's stupid. What did I care? I'm sitting in I walked out 20 feet from my back door, walked into my cool shed, did a podcast. Thousands of people have listened to it and are like, hey, that's rad. And those thousands of people came back from last week too. So I'm not gonna let one guy ruin my day.
Yeah. Same thing when somebody's like, oh, that was the worst cheeseburger I ever had. And it's like, but the 10,000 people that loved it, they're too busy enjoying it to take the time to say something about it.
Totally.
Well, I did a ton of research when I started this, trying to figure out, the mics, the setup, what I needed to use, the format behind it, how to make it work. Because I'm one of those ones. If I dive into something, it's full out. I don't go into anything. So, and I was following guys like you and Rogue and stuff like that to try to see formats and see how things worked. So, yours was definitely one of the ones that I listened to before I started this.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah, and I'd say our format's so much different than most that are out there, because of my partner coming from the radio world and having the kind of the flow of a morning show. But I think that's what made us different and fun in the beginning. I got to recapture some of that magic that gets lost when you don't have the banter all the time. But I'm figuring it out. And like I said, our numbers are really good. We're back in a growth mode again, and it's just a matter of plugging in the right people so that people go, yeah, this is interesting. I want to know more.
Do you see the podcast space taking off the way YouTube took off?
I don't know if it'll ever take off the way video did, although there's a lot of stuff happening. And in the last study I saw said that podcast is back in growth again. And it seems like the problem is like you look at Apple and the way Apple does their charts isn't the best. It's a mixture of what they call the hotness scale, a mixture of how many people have engaged with it. It's a mixture of how many people downloaded it, how many people downloaded it within a certain amount of time, and it's only done on like phones with the last like two operating systems.
Really?
So it's a very narrow category. It's really only a snapshot of what's actually happening. So you there's no rhyme or reason why something appears higher in the Apple charts than something else. Because you'll go to other charts that are strictly based on downloads, and you'll be like, "Well, why am I way higher here and over on Apple I'm not?" And so one of the things I always encourage people to do is leave 5-star reviews or engage, because those engagements help you with discoverability. And that's the hardest thing about podcasting. It's fairly easy to get into, and there's so many of them that the discoverability is hard, which is why, again, I wanted to name this something that was really stinking easy to find if you were doing a search.
Even if you just search trucks in podcasts, it pops up.
And so I think that was probably maybe one of the smarter things I ever did.
So how do you have an East Coast West Coast spat, as you called it, with another podcast? Like, I enjoy working with people. Like I said, I have you on, Brian Good from Grinder, or I guess the Drop with Frank and Brian, Mulligan. Like, you guys are people that created this before I did. So to be able to link up and discuss the magazines and the way all this stuff works is good. So why would someone have an issue with it?
So it was the old radio station that my former co-host Jay worked at. They had a podcast, and they were giving him crap because he had left and then started this podcast, and it was outside of like the radio world, right? And anyway, some listeners got into it, and then somebody said you should just go and ruin his podcast by giving him 1-star reviews. And I'm like, oh. And it's just like, that is not, in growth mode, that is not what you need. And so um we were able to get those guys to back off and people to change their reviews, and I went to Apple and got a bunch of them removed. But they thought it was funny. It wasn't even like a "we hate you." It was like, let's screw our friend who left us and is no longer here and make life interesting, because that would be funny to us, not realizing like there's some collateral damage that comes from that as well. And I'm still paying for that today.
Well, you mentioned that you see almost a resurgence in the print world. Where do you see the custom vehicle world going, since you've been tied to it for so long?
Oh, I don't think it's going anywhere. I mean, you'll even see some of the stupider things that are out there, some of the new cars being customized. So customizing is here for the long haul. I think what's going to happen, though, depending on with regulations and stuff with the new president, a couple of things I got my eye on. One is any vehicles that are mid 2000s and older are going to suddenly become really valuable. Even, for example, the new Super Duty has over-the-air updates. So what happens if it's your work truck and you're at a ranch or something like that, you don't have self-service and your truck doesn't have the ability to do an over-the-air update? Does it just brick eventually? Does it, when you get into town, it's unusable while it downloads all this updated crap that they want to send you? There's a bunch of companies talking about subscription services. BMW did it with seat heaters on a car equipped with it, but you had to pay
Yeah,
like $7 a month or whatever.
BMW did that.
Yeah, Mercedes, you can buy unlock keys to unlock more power. Jeep's talked about that on the new Wagoneer S for their EV. So I think people are getting really fed up with subscriptions and not being able to just own the vehicle. And I think you're going to see it happen the way it is with all the farmers with John Deere and Right to Repair. They're buying all the non-computerized combines and stuff. And so they're paying millions of dollars for 20 and 30-year-old machines because they don't have all the computers and stuff on it. They don't have the over-the-air updates. They're not locked out by the manufacturer. So I think that side of the market, if you want to get into that, you probably need to do it in the next 5 years to get whatever that dream vehicle it is. Because if it's 60s, that stuff's almost all gone. 70s, as we know, is coming on hard now, especially Broncos, especially square body Chevys, early 80s.
That's why
But
I'm building a 77 K5 right now.
there you go. And 80 in the mid 80 square bodies are getting scooped up, and those got really expensive in the last, probably 2 years. Well, those are those vehicles that are either carbureted, non-computerized, or early computers, fuel injected. Those are going to be gone pretty fast because there's only a finite number of them. And I think people are going to look at, do I want the new truck, or can I buy a 10-year-old used truck with low miles on it? Now you can see mile vehicles with massive premiums because it's like getting a 10-year-old new truck, right? As far as going forward, thank God for SEMA and the aftermarket, because if it weren't for them, I don't know what we would do. But you know, with all the encryption on the ECUs, with the self-driving, them having to be, make sure that those are encrypted so if somebody can't hack into it and then drive a fleet of Teslas into a school or something like that, it's gonna harm the freedom that we have to do modifications. So there's going to be a balance there, but thankfully the aftermarket always figures out a way. I don't think there's anything that's come yet that they haven't figured something out. We're pretty smart, and customization is not going to go anywhere. It's just going to be either the extent that you can customize or the limitations you're willing to live with post customization. For example, if you can't adjust your tire size, are you okay with living that your speedo and odometer can be off forever? Or if you can't get into something on the CAN bus and now your radio doesn't work, but you have everything else you want, are you willing to make that sacrifice? And I think for a little while, as we kind of navigate new vehicles, sensors, um, all of the computers, all of the features, because all these things have so many different. I mean, how many? You probably have 50 computer chips in one car now today, right? So I think there'll be a transitional period where we figure out how to navigate it, and I think there's going to be some limitations once you modify it to what the end result is and what you're willing to accept.
Well, it's like the Tahoe I built for my wife for this past year's SEMA. You put LED bulbs in it because it didn't have tail light or LED taillights in it. And now all of a sudden you drive down the road and the screen pops up one of the side cameras, and it's like, what in the world's with that? And now it needs resistors on every bulb because it throws everything off. But that and the Sierra I did for 23 were both the 3-liter diesel.
Hmm.
Everybody's like, oh, delete it, delete it, delete it. I'm like, you can't. They're like,
Yeah,
what's garbage then? I'm like, I don't have no trouble out of it. I get 30 miles a gallon out of it.
yeah. Well, and there's other issues too, like on some of the big Duramax diesels, the mass airflow sensor is calibrated to a certain thing. So if you put a bigger one on it, it goes, "Oh my gosh, your power or your airflow is out of parameters. We're actually going to pull back power." So whatever gains you maybe had for that first 10 minutes on a dyno run disappear immediately as the computer adjusts. Says, "Oh, something's not right. Let's dial it back," and then they take it away. So there are so many nuances to tuning and modifying. I mean, look at Whipple and Ford. The only reason Dust has that relationship with Ford is because Ford gave him access to that little tiny room on the ECU so that he could make the tuning changes and stuff. And being tied with them as the factory, that relationship is there, and he can take advantage of it. A lot of other suspension manufacturers or supercharger manufacturers are trying to figure out, like, what do we do? How do we access this? We don't want this other self driving stuff, but we want this little area where we can do the tune. Well, what happens if the car knows that its stopping distance is X or 0 to 60 is X or whatever? And now when it's self driving, because there's a blower on it, all of a sudden it freaks out because the car is doing something that's outside of its parameters. There's so much stuff we haven't even discovered yet, like what the problems could potentially be downstream.
Didn't even think of stuff like that, all the stuff working together.
Well, think about this. What's going to happen when they decide everything's self-driving at some point and you've got a dumb truck? I've got my 67 to 72 Ford F100 driving with all the smart cars. Am I going to be allowed to drive on the same roads as them? Am I going to need a transponder wired in that tells all the other cars that I'm a dumb car and to avoid me at all costs? I don't know. Like, what's that going to look like? What happens if you have two self-driving cars? And this is an example that I read a few years ago, and it's never left me because it's one of those things where you're going like, oh man, two cars. One is, let's say it's a mainstream brand, and one's a luxury brand. They're driving autonomously, and they're going to come and they're going to wreck. There's no avoiding. Both cars know that a crash is imminent. There's no algorithm or change that they can get out of it. Who's at fault if somebody dies? And what happens if you find out that the luxury car manufacturer in their algorithm says save your customer at all costs, but the other mainstream car says save the outsider at all costs?
Wow.
So now you have a computer deciding who lives or dies in an accident for how maybe they pitched the vehicle or whatever. And so who's gonna cover that? I mean, there's so many like philosophical questions and things of that nature that you just don't know yet. And what what um I can't talk today. Ideology is going to win in a case like that.
I don't know if I could do the self driving stuff. I had an Audi RS6 Avant, one of the wagons,
Mhm.
and it had the with the adaptive cruise, it would steer for you and stuff. And the first couple times that steering wheel moved in my hand, I thought I'd wrecked. Like I immediately was like, all right, I'm in the wall. I don't even know what's going on here.
Yeah, yeah.
But
Well,
like stepping from the adaptive cruise stuff back to regular cruise, I'm putting on the 77 K5.
it's
It's like,
impossible.
yeah,
I'm spoiled on adaptive cruise, but I drive a lot. Like I drive 50,
same.
60,000 miles a year. So I'm all for adaptive cruise. I recently had a Hummer EV SUV, and it had what GM calls their, I think it's their Blue Cruise, where it was self driving, or is that Ford? I don't know. One of them,
Super
Super
cruise.
Cruise. Super
Yeah.
Cruise is GM, and Blue Cruise is Ford. So I drove it, and the freakiest thing about it is it does self lane changes. So you're driving and you can do hands off, and it's weird because you're just sitting there with your hands in your lap. And this is a system that is not hands on, but it does track your eye movement, so it'll cut out if if you're not doing your looking ahead and all that.
Yeah.
But it was crazy that the first time all of a sudden the blinker goes on and it lurches into the other lane. And I was like, "What was that?" Took me a while, and then so if you're set at cruise control, let's say the freeway is 70 and you're set at 78 and the flow of traffic 75, it'll keep trying to pass the dude in front of you if there's room and get you, and then puts you back in the number one lane or number two lane. It'll get you over the number one, over the number two. And I had a guy who tried to merge into me at the same time. The car was making its lane change, and it did an evasive maneuver and pulled back. And I was like, thank you, car, for doing that. But that was weird, So I don't know. It's like anything else. You probably get used to it and love it in 10 years. I don't want them to take the steering wheel out of my hand. I like driving, but where I am in SoCal, I'm fine with, can I just make it auto drive when it's in stop and go traffic and I'm on commuting somewhere for 45 minutes, and then I can just like do other things like emails, cuz you're not driving at that point. At that point you're just like, it's annoying. So I can see it. I would be okay with it there. I know it's a slippery slope, but I definitely would not want it full self driving.
I know I'll get my Maverick and go to drive it, and I'll set the cruise, and I'll forget that it don't have adaptive cruise, and
Yeah,
I'm like, okay, why is this thing not stopping? I'm like, keep looking down. I'm like, why is this thing not? Oh shoot, I'm in this truck.
yeah. I do that all the time because I get a bunch of different vehicles. Like I had, I'm trying to think of what the last thing that I drove that didn't have adaptive cruise control. It's amazing how many. I was even in a little Nissan Kicks the other day, and that has adaptive cruise control. I was like, whoa! And then a Tacoma SR5 has adaptive cruise control now, which is the second from the bottom rung. But yeah, I'll get into something every once in a while. I'm so used to having adaptive cruise and everything. I'll get into something else, and I'm like, oh yeah, all right, I have to drive this one. You get spoiled.
Well, my Maverick's one of the XL models, so it's got manual mirrors and actually a
Yeah,
key. My daughter's 24 and she makes fun of me. She goes, "You don't have seat heaters or nothing in this." I'm like, "No, I bought a cheap truck for a reason.
yeah, I'm a man. I don't
I
need
can
that
start
stuff.
it with my phone." She goes, "How do you start it with your phone, but it don't have seat heaters?" She goes, "That's the dumbest thing ever."
You're like, shut up and give me my blanket. It's cold outside. You're driving your Maverick with a shawl on or something.
Yeah, I actually just got it lowered. Been waiting about a year or so, Beltec to come out with their new
Mhm.
coilover kit, and that's how those trucks should have came. That
Oh,
little
for
bit of
sure.
lowered,
I
like
just got at the end of last year, went and saw the new Lobo in person, and that thing is rad. So the drive on that should be coming up. So I can't wait to get behind the wheel because it's got the torque vectoring rear diff out of the Bronco Sport, and it's
really.
set. Yeah, so they have a mode that makes it rear wheel drive bias. So you can do donuts in it. And I'm like, yeah.
Is it? But it's all wheel drive
Mhm.
regularly.
Yep, pretty
I mean, you
cool.
could just undo the drive shaft, couldn't you? I mean, and
Well, but since it's a longitudinally mounted front engine, your two
I
of your
guess you
trans
can't.
axles are
Yeah,
kinda stuck, yeah, so you can take out the, prop shaft and make it front wheel drive, but, so Ford, the guys behind it were some enthusiasts at Ford, and they were the same guys who were at SEMA the first year the Mavericks came out when all the lowered ones and all the graphics, so they started taking notes on what they could do, and they realized all the stuff that the guys at SEMA were doing was parts car stuff. It's like, oh, Focus ST brakes and, a quicker steering rack out of an Escape and radiator out of this car and a Lincoln 2.3 in place of the 2-liter turbo. And they went, well, we have access to all this. So the Lobo is a total parts bin car. It takes from vehicles from around the world, and it came out rad. So I can't wait to get behind the wheel of that one. I wanted to hate that truck so bad when it came out. It's just a little Ridgeline unibody. I whatever. And then I had one, and I'm like, damn it. I can't hate it. It's actually really good. And the funny thing is the cheap one, so it's not a truck that was decontented. It's a cheap truck that was made to be a cheap truck, and it's unapologetically cheap, and it's funky. It's got some cool textures and plastics, and it looks cool, but it's not hiding that it's cheap. So you get in, you're like, I get it. I'm getting a cheap truck, and I like it because it's, but you get into like an F-150 that's an XL, and it feels like a cheap truck. The Maverick doesn't. The Maverick feels like just how it's supposed to feel.
I know mine's the Eco Boost, and it's got intake exhaust. We got a custom tune teamed up with Cobb Tuning. Then we did a dyno
Nice.
tune on it. I mean, it's 267 horse,
Oh,
334 torque
dude, plenty in that car.
for an all-wheel
Yeah.
drive. Like it's all I need. Like you forget about it. You got to change lanes, and it pushes you back, and you're like,
Yeah.
oh wow, forgot that was there.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
no,
even the tag on it says under budget. Like I bought it to be, I did several install articles on some stuff, but
yeah.
like you mentioned the ones with graphics. So like Jeremy's blue one, I shot that
Mhm.
cover, and then Kenneth's silver one with the graphics, I shot that one as well. So I seem to have the lock on some of those Mavericks when they first come out.
I like I said, I wanted to hate them, and I just can't. They're freaking real cool.
Well, I won't keep you. I know you're a busy man. I appreciate you coming on discussing some of this. Tell the listeners where they can find you and check out all your content.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing would be truckshowpodcast.com or at Truck Show Podcast on Facebook and Instagram. And then OVR Mag, ovrmag.com, and at OVR Mag if you love the more off-road stuff. And at Sean P. Holman, SeanPHolman on Instagram. You can find me in all those places. And if you love the Truck Show Podcast, go ahead and feel free to join the Podshed Insiders on our Facebook group, which is really cool because you get to interact with some of our top fans and people that are always calling in or writing letters to the show, and it's been a lot of fun in there lately.
I'll have to hit that up when we get off here. I didn't know about that one. So
Yeah, just launched it about a month ago, and yeah, it's been great. There's some great discussions in there. Now people are asking other questions like, hey, what gun should I get, or hey, I've got this truck, what should I do? And now they're just talking to themselves. They don't even need me anymore, and it's fun to watch the interaction between them of like off topic stuff. So it's pretty cool.
well, like I said, good to finally, I guess, link up with you like this after all these years of kind of seeing your name float around. And like you said, if you've picked some of the cover stuff that I've got here, then you've seen my name float around.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Hopefully it's all been good stuff and not seeing the photos and be like, this shit's garbage. I can't do this.
I don't know. With all those plaques and covers behind your head, I think you did pretty good for yourself.
Well, the plaques are my vehicles. The covers are all stuff that I'd shot. And I'm actually out of room. I'm gonna have to figure out got 2 new covers that I can't even hang up in here now. So
Nice. Well, that's a good problem to have, right?
my first one, Dan Ward gave me a truck in February 05, and that started the trend for me. So
Well, I'm glad to be able to do this, and best of luck to you on the podcast. And it's always fun to be a guest. I think when the thing I've learned is going on other podcasts, those are your biggest growth opportunities because the world of podcasting, it's such an intimate media that everybody who's listening has like a really high trust scale. And if I say, hey, go listen to this guy, they're like, all right, I'll go listen to that guy. So make sure you tag me on the social for this, and I'll get that pushed out for you too.
will do. I appreciate it, man.
All right.